Most defendants quietly accept their punishment and move on. The legal system, with its cold efficiency, tends to crush those who don't know how to fight back. But Pam Bondi was no ordinary defendant. When she was slapped with an unexpected fine, instead of slinking into submission, she dug in her heels and struck with such precision that the judge himself began to second-guess his ruling. It all started like any other day. The sun streamed through the windows of courtroom 3B, casting light on the polished wood and gray carpet. The sound of muffled footsteps echoed in the hallway. But inside the room, everything was still. Pam Bondi, sitting at the defendant's table, glanced at her notes and prepared for what she assumed would be a routine hearing. She'd been in this courtroom more times than she could count. Judge Raymond Dalton, who was presiding today, was no stranger to her. She was used to the atmosphere of law, to the hum of anticipation before each case. Today felt no different, at least not at first. Across the room, the city attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His fingers nervously adjusted his tie, a nervous tick that betrayed his calm exterior. He had clearly underestimated what was about to unfold. Little did he know, the calm before the storm was about to be shattered. Pam had handled all sorts of legal cases in her career. She had seen her fair share of minor disputes, petty fines, and bureaucratic hurdles. This was supposed to be just another one of those. A procedural matter, something that would barely take 10 minutes. But when Judge Dalton entered the room, Pam's gut told her something wasn't right. Dalton wasn't the type to waste time. As the door swung open, his tall frame filled the room, and his eyes immediately locked onto Pam. He didn't look at the papers on the desk, nor did he glance at the city attorney. He didn't need to. He had a presence that demanded attention. His graying beard and deep-set eyes exuded authority, and the quiet way he carried himself only amplified it. Unlike most judges who reviewed their files, took a moment to settle in, and exchanged pleasantries, Dalton cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Let's get right to it," he said in a flat, almost emotionless tone. Pam straightened in her seat, feeling the shift in energy. Something was off. "The court has reviewed the matter at hand," Dalton continued, "and after considering the arguments, I find that the defendant is in violation of Local Statute 14B and is therefore subject to a fine of $110,000 payable immediately." Silence. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Pam's brow lifted slightly. The shock of it settled in her chest, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't just unexpected. It was jarring. There was no prior discussion, no debate, no opportunity for the defense to speak. A ruling had been handed down in an instant, as if the judge had already decided the outcome before even hearing a word. She took a moment to process, her eyes flicking across the room. The city attorney, still visibly rattled by the speed of the proceedings, looked at her with an almost apologetic expression. Even he hadn't expected things to move this quickly. Pam's calm demeanor remained unshaken. She folded her hands neatly on the table and spoke in her usual measured voice. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my arguments." Dalton barely blinked. He didn't need to hear her argument. His decision had already been made. "The arguments are irrelevant," he replied coolly. "The violation is clear. The law is clear." Pam inhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain composed. The room felt suffocating, like a pressure had suddenly descended. This wasn't just about the case. This was personal. The violation? Yes, it was real, but it didn't make sense. And this ruling? It reeked of an agenda. She didn't trust her gut instincts often, but in that moment, she knew. This wasn't a decision based purely on the facts. Someone had made up their mind before she even opened her mouth. And that, to Pam, was unacceptable. She met Judge Dalton's gaze directly. His eyes were hard, but she didn't look away. A subtle game of power had begun, and Pam wasn't about to let him dictate the terms of the fight. If the law were that clear, we wouldn't be here, Your Honor. I request the opportunity to present my defense, she said firmly. Dalton leaned back slightly in his chair. There was a small, almost imperceptible shift in his posture. His lips curled, not into a smile, but something closer to a challenge. "You're welcome to try, Ms. Bondi," he said, his tone a little too smug. "But I assure you, the outcome will be the same." That was the moment Pam realized what this was really about. It wasn't just about a fine. It wasn't about local statute 14b. It was about her. Pam folded her hands on the table, her posture relaxed but assertive. "I am aware of that ruling, Your Honor," she replied, meeting his gaze head-on. "But I also know that the same clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards, something that, in this case, was not done." Whitaker nodded, as if he had expected her to say that, his fingers gently tapping the table. He leaned back, preparing for the next move. "Then let's talk about that," he said, his voice even, almost inviting her to dig deeper. "The enforcement officer who filed the violation is present in this courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him?" Pam's eyes flicked toward the officer, surprised by the development. She hadn't expected this move, but the opportunity to cross-examine could turn the tide in her favor. She welcomed the chance. She turned her head as Officer Brian Calloway, a municipal enforcement officer, stood up from the back of the room. He was middle-aged, his Navy uniform crisp and neatly pressed. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who rarely had to justify his actions. Pam's gaze never wavered as she addressed Dalton. "Yes, Your Honor, I would." Dalton gave a brief nod, gesturing for Officer Calloway to step forward. The officer moved toward the witness stand, taking his oath with the precision of someone accustomed to testifying. Once seated, Pam stood, taking slow, deliberate steps toward him. The tension in the room was palpable. "Officer Calloway," Pam began, her voice controlled but sharp, "can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation?" The officer nodded, his response immediate. "Yes, ma'am." Pam turned slightly toward the jury box, where no jury sat, but where the public's eyes were trained on the proceedings. The courtroom hung on her every word. "And on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred?" Pam asked, her voice steady, probing. Calloway exhaled sharply, as if the answer should have been obvious to anyone in the room. "The statute is clear. The property in question was not in compliance with municipal code. I documented it and issued the fine." Pam clasped her hands behind her back, walking a few steps as she processed his response. "Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation?" she asked, her tone almost casual, though her mind was already working through the implications. He hesitated, his eyes shifting slightly as he weighed his answer. "No, ma'am, it wasn't necessary," Calloway responded, his tone somewhat defensive, as if it was self-evident why photographs weren't needed. Pam gave him a small, almost amused smile, a glimmer of triumph dancing in her eyes. "You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine?" she asked, her voice sharp with incredulity. Calloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the spotlight now firmly on him. "I have years of experience identifying these cases. I didn't need a photo to confirm what I saw," he answered, his tone brimming with authority, but lacking the solid foundation that would convince a seasoned lawyer like Pam. Pam's calm exterior betrayed nothing, but inside, she knew she had just been handed her next argument on a silver platter. This was the crack she needed to exploit. She turned back toward the bench, her movements deliberate. "Your Honor," she began, her voice ringing out across the courtroom with newfound strength. "In the absence of photographic evidence, written witness statements, or any tangible proof, we are left with nothing more than an individual's subjective assessment. This directly contradicts the evidentiary standards required under the appellate clarification Judge Whitaker referenced earlier." Whitaker's expression didn't change, but Pam could see the subtle shift in his posture. He knew she was right. This wasn't a technicality. It was a fundamental flaw in the case against her. Even the judge, sitting silently, couldn't ignore the holes in the officer's testimony. Pam pressed forward, not allowing them the chance to regroup. "So I ask again, how does this court justify imposing a fine under a statute that lacks the required legal foundation for enforcement?" she demanded, her voice ringing with authority. The silence in the room was deafening. Every person in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the judge's response. The air was thick with anticipation, each word hanging heavy with consequence. Judge Dalton's fingers drummed against the bench, a small but telling gesture. He wasn't looking at Whitaker, and Pam recognized the significance of that. The judge, who had so confidently delivered the initial ruling, was now looking anywhere but at his legal advisor. He had expected to win this argument. He had expected Whitaker's presence to back her into a corner. But instead, Pam had taken their counterpoint and used it to unravel the case against her. Dalton exhaled sharply, his eyes narrowing as he processed the weight of the situation. "This court will take another recess," he said, his voice low, the words falling like a hammer. Pam resisted the urge to smile. She knew exactly what was happening. The tide was turning. They were running out of ways to push back, and they knew it. As the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, Pam remained seated, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She had made her case. Now it was up to the judge to either acknowledge the truth or risk losing face. Either way, Pam had just set the stage for the next move. When the court reconvened, what Dalton did next would surprise everyone. Pam's hands remained folded on the table, her posture unchanged. She was ready. But no one could have predicted what was about to unfold next in this high-stakes courtroom battle. Stay with us, because this drama is just getting started. If you're not already subscribed, make sure you hit that button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Another recess, that wasn't a good sign. For the judge, it meant he was struggling to regain control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. A judge who had been confident enough to assert his power and pass down a swift ruling now found himself on the defensive. The longer he waited, the clearer it became that Pam's arguments were hitting their mark. But Pam knew better than to celebrate too soon. Dalton was no novice. He was a man of authority. And if there was one thing people in power hated more than anything, it was being challenged. He wouldn't back down that easily. He had something to prove, and she had just handed him a chance to do so. The real battle, she knew, was still ahead. When the court finally reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The moment the doors swung open and the judge entered, a subtle shift rippled through the room. Gone was the passive confidence he had walked in with earlier. The facade of ease had evaporated. Now, his jaw was set, his expression unreadable, a mask of authority that barely concealed the strain beneath. Whitaker remained seated beside him, but his posture was more reserved than before. The seasoned attorney now appeared more like an observer than an active participant in the proceedings, and his reluctance to engage spoke volumes. It was clear he had no intention of intervening, at least not yet. Dalton cleared his throat and for the first time acknowledged Pam's arguments with a hint of measured respect. "Miss Bondi," he began, his tone even but tight, "you've presented compelling arguments, Pam didn't flinch. She had heard this before, but this time the words felt different. There was something almost begrudging in his delivery, like he was admitting she had gotten under his skin. However, he continued, this court still finds the core issue remains unchanged. The fine stands. Pam blinked once. That was interesting. So, he was doubling down. She exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. She nodded, as if carefully considering his words. But then, without missing a beat, she turned to the court stenographer. Can you read back the last statement, please? Pam's voice rang out, cutting through the tense silence. The stenographer, a woman in her 40s with sharp, observant eyes, barely hesitated before repeating. The fine stands. Pam turned back to Dalton. She was precise, her voice unwavering. Your Honor, just so I understand correctly, are you stating, on record, that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof, in direct contradiction to established appellate precedent? Dalton's fingers twitched against the bench. His jaw tightened, a visible sign of the growing pressure. He wasn't accustomed to being so openly challenged. Not like this. Miss Bondi, he replied, his voice tinged with irritation. This court has discretion. Pam's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. She didn't let the opportunity slip away. It does. But discretion is not immunity from legal standards. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the quiet shift in his posture betraying his growing unease. He could sense where this was going, and he wasn't the only one. The courtroom's energy had shifted, the spectators' attention now solely focused on Pam's next move. Pam straightened, taking a step closer to the bench, her words carrying the weight of someone fully in control of the moment. Let's put this in plain terms, shall we? She said, her voice crisp, deliberate. If this ruling stands, it sets a dangerous precedent. It means that any enforcement officer can issue a fine based on nothing more than their word. No evidence, no documentation, just an assertion. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Dalton's silence told her everything she needed to know. The tension in the room thickened, but Pam wasn't done. She turned toward the gallery, sweeping her gaze across the attorneys, clerks, and bystanders who had sat through the hearing, some of whom were now nodding subtly in agreement. Imagine the implications of that, Pam continued, her voice rising slightly. A business owner gets fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner is penalized for something they can't even verify, and if they challenge it, too bad, the court has discretion. The subtle nods continued. The message was clear. Pam was speaking truth to power, and the audience knew it. Pam turned back to Dalton, her gaze unflinching. That's not discretion, Your Honor, she said, her voice firm. That's unchecked authority. The weight of her words sank deep into the room. Even the city attorney seemed to hesitate, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the implications. There was no mistaking it. Pam had just shown the court what was truly at stake. Whitaker was the first to speak, but his words were cautious, as though testing the waters. You're arguing that allowing this fine to proceed without evidence would undermine due process? He asked, his tone more neutral than before. Pam nodded, her conviction unwavering. Not just due process, she replied, but judicial integrity. Because the moment we accept rulings based on assertion rather than evidence, the entire legal system starts to erode. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened. His knuckles whitened as he processed the weight of her argument. He knew he had been backed into a corner. He was a man of authority, but now he could feel the walls closing in. Pam's logic was undeniable, and it was clear the courtroom was beginning to see it too. The city attorney finally interjected, his voice sharp but uncertain. Your Honor, if I may, Dalton held up a hand, silencing him. His face remained unreadable, but Pam could see the frustration flicker behind his eyes. There was no winning this, not for him. He had been outmaneuvered, and now it was only a matter of time before he had to concede. After what felt like an eternity, Dalton exhaled sharply, the sound echoing in the quiet courtroom. This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement, he announced, his voice stiff, almost reluctant. The fine is overturned. A murmur rippled through the room as the weight of the decision sank in. Pam gave a slow, polite nod. No satisfaction, no gloating, just quiet certainty. She had fought the battle, and she had won. But she wasn't one for public triumph. She didn't need to rub anyone's face in it. The law had spoken. Dalton's gavel struck the bench with a sharp tap, breaking the silence. "Court adjourned," he said, his voice final. And just like that, it was over.